CDC right now, however, is really setting a new standard for incompetence.
Right. Yeah, I think, unfortunately, that's spot on. So, Stu, we just had some recent guidance change from the CDC, which, if it sounds like I've mentioned that before, I probably have, maybe about 1,000 times. The latest is that the CDC has issued some guidance shortening the window that people need to quarantine if they've been exposed to COVID or if they have symptoms. This, mind you, only after a new variant that has been impacting blue states comes out, and a lot of frustration and chatter at the time about how these long isolations that the rest of the country have been forced to suffer through, those simply couldn't cut it for the folks who have done all the right things all along.
Yeah, it's interesting because, look, I mean, we all look at this science every day. I'm not some virologist, but we spend a lot of time going over this stuff. And this sort of change seems actually pretty rational to me, right? I mean, 10 days to me seems completely absurd. They say 90% of the infections and the transmission happens within these 5 days. So shortening it makes sense. It's just that, like, it doesn't seem like these changes come from a position of science. They changed it to 5 days. Now they want to add a testing requirement after getting pressure from other groups. Like, pressure is supposed to be what science is supposed to ignore. It's not supposed to have anything to do with pressure.
Exactly. And Stu, most of this pressure is coming from pretty well-heeled financially and politically powerful organizations, right? Not only has it been a lot of folks in the press who have had a lot of objections to the new CDC guidance, but the Nursing Association, the lobbying group that represents nurses, their union, they've come out against this rule. There's been a lot of kind of commentary and chatter about how workers feel disposable because of this new rule. And so all of a sudden you do have these forces that push back, and mind you, in a very narrow window. The new CDC guidance came out less than a week ago, and now just today, Dr. Fauci said that he called it a clarification of the guidance is apparently coming down the pike to make it, I guess, make more sense. And it's incredible when you think about it, because Stu, I think you make a really good point about how science is kind of one of the few things we should have that should be unassailable from these sorts of political pressures. And yet we saw almost overnight that a handful of organizations and then a lot of media people putting a little bit of pressure on a rule that they don't like almost instantly forces the science to then correct itself.
Yeah. And again, like, there's a couple of institutions that are supposed to be outside of that back and forth. Science is one of them. The courts are another. And we've seen over the past, I think, few months in particular, the courts have done a pretty good job at ignoring the craziness that is in the media and the back and forth and all of that. And that's exactly what it's supposed to do. Science does not seem to be doing the same thing and hitting that standard. And it's frustrating to watch because even as we point out, some of these changes are moving closer to what conservatives want. But we've been beat over the head that we're evil, that we are going to get kicked off of social media for mentioning that this might be a good idea. And now the media just comes in and says, OK, we've changed it to what you guys have been saying for the past year, and we're not even going to acknowledge it.
Right. And at no point is there any effort to reconcile those two opinions and how they differed over time. Right. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of conservatives find really frustrating is that for years now, right, as we enter kind of calendar year 3 of this pandemic, for years it has been the science has said, the science has said, the science has said. And all of a sudden, I think one of the interesting parts of this ruling, which I agree with you, I think it does make a lot of sense, is you saw the director of the CDC, Rochelle Walensky, just came out and said, we had to shorten this because we didn't think people were going to do it, right? we didn't think that people would be able to tolerate a 10-day lockdown. And it's like, wow, no kidding. Amazing, because at no point previously do I think that people were more inclined to be willing to tolerate these really long lockdowns. It's just that now it seems like when there's a different group of stakeholders who all of a sudden are very concerned about these new restrictions and limitations, well, a little bit more of a common sense overlay kind of comes in on all of these things. And so conservatives, even when we agree with the rationale and what's happened, I think it leads a lot of us, you and I included, kind of sitting back and saying, well, what are we doing here, guys? And what have we been doing all along if these are the measures that we're willing to roll out when it's convenient?
You've been posting a lot of these on your Twitter account, some moments of hypocrisy that we saw. Another great example of this is we saw for a while, kids are resilient. They can do homeschooling. They can do it on Zoom. They'll be completely fine. Now the science is coming out and telling us that there's been real negative effects of these policies that we were supposed to ignore for the first year and a half of this. We were supposed to just say, no, we have to keep these kids at home. Why are you whining about socialization when lives are on the line? Why do you want to kill grandma? Now all the science is coming out on the opposite side of that. And again, I don't see any reconciliation attempt.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Stu, none of it's, I don't think, is particularly shocking, right? I actually wrote about a number of these different issues over a year ago now, in late December of 2020, because we had pretty conclusive studies about what things like isolation do to people, particularly teenagers, about the negative impacts of not being in a classroom setting when it comes to learning. A lot of this information was widely available when we were trying to make these decisions. And you're right, again, when anyone objected, even in the slightest, that, hey, maybe there are other things we should consider or other things that we should be willing to take into account when we're making some of these decisions, rather than this mantra of if it even saves one life, it has to be worth it. You were called anti-science, right? You were thrown under the bus as someone who isn't taking the pandemic seriously, who doesn't take the lives and well-being of children seriously, when all along that's been entirely misguided. And now, unfortunately, we are starting to see the scientific results of what it says about those decisions and the long-term damage that's already being done to kids.
One of the more obvious political ones to me that has really hit me reading the quotes and watching the clips again was this idea that Joe Biden was going to shut down the virus, right? He was going to get elected. He was going to shut down the virus. We played the clip a little earlier where he said in a debate, anyone with 220,000 deaths from a pandemic should not even be allowed to be president. And here he is at 420,000 deaths. No one at any point goes back and says, wait a minute. Not only is Joe Biden wrong now, which is something we should acknowledge, he didn't do what he said he was going to do, but it's on us as journalists that are supposed to be, a wall against misinformation to at the time call out that the president can't come in and flip a switch. Is it just that they wanted the outcome of Trump being gone so badly that they ignore it, and then again they don't have to go back and reconcile their total lack of journalism from back in 2020 when the election was going on?
Yeah, Stu, unfortunately, I think that probably was a pretty big driving factor. The other thing that I think is important is that for a lot of people, both within the press and beyond it, they looked at Trump as kind of this caricature, right? And not for nothing, and said, this guy has no idea what he's doing. He has no idea what he's talking about. We're in this once in a lifetime moment where surely there's something we can do to stop all this horror and the carnage that we see going on around us. And he's not doing it, or he's not taking it seriously, or he's slow walking the original deaths and the original kind of outbreaks, and that there was something wrong there, right? And so I think what happened is maybe less malicious and more of this kind of blindness to say, well, surely if we had someone better and smarter who understood the machinations of government better all along, that things would have been different, they would have been better, what have you. And the harsh reality that I think we've learned in the months since, and I think a lot of us on the other side of the aisle were pretty tuned into from the start, was that there's not necessarily a lot we can do with these sorts of things, that lockdowns maybe aren't as effective as we think they are, that school closures don't necessarily stop spreads, that absent kind of this really totalitarian crackdown on everyday life, it's really, really hard to stop a virus. And it's really hard to stop a virus in a developed country when we have great healthcare and everything else. But so many journalists were unwilling, I think, to apply that standard as soon as they saw someone who they saw as reasonable, respectable, an elder statesman, if you will, who was saying we could be doing something different. And rather than actually interrogate that allegation and say, could we have done anything different? Could we actually have moved the needle on this stuff? They said, well, it is this Trump guy. We know he's awful. He's bad, yada, yada, yada. And so surely there had to be something else there.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, and it's really frustrating. I have to say, and I think you look at like some of these like draconian sort of measures, and I think the problem with progressivism in general is so much of this stuff exists in this weird like academic world where like if we all were hamsters, right, and someone was putting us all into cages and isolating us 100 feet away in bubbles, well, there would be no transmission of the virus. We do know that in theory a lockdown could work, but you're talking about real human beings here who do different things. Right. And one of the things I've been interested about over the past I don't know, week or two as I've been, been on vacation and watching all this stuff develop. We did a little traveling. Is that like there's a market effect going on here, which is as much as the left wants to say they like masks and they like staying in, they like lockdowns, you see it in politician after politician. They can't stop themselves from going out to bars and dance clubs because in reality, even liberals want to go out and do things. And I think now we're at that point where I don't know if the administration is finally realizing that they can't control these things anymore. And they want to hold on to this moralistic, we're better than you idea. If you guys would just listen to the science, we could beat this thing. But in reality, they know even their side is going out to bars, they're going out to restaurants. And now that they've lost a little bit of control over that and they see it slipping away, now they're trying to adjust their standards as if, well, we don't need to do those things anymore. Is that market effect real? Am I seeing that correctly?
And yeah, I think you're right. I think that is real. I think one of the things that has really happened across all this, I think that you mentioning the academia aspect of this is a good place to start, because I think in a lot of cases, what's happened on the left side of the aisle across this entire pandemic is that there were great master's theses to write about how we could shut down the virus, how we could stop it, how everything could go on well, that simply haven't survived contact with reality. And rather than go back and say, I guess the expectations that led me to that conclusion were wrong, rather than do that, because that's a hard process for anyone to do, right? You'd have to really start to chip away at, well, what are the things that I still believe that are guiding me to believe this thing that didn't survive contact with reality? It's a lot easier to move the goalpost on the back end, right? And so you have something like Fauci coming out and saying, hey, you know what, actually, don't look at cases. We're shattering all-time highs, the number of new cases in the country. And he says, hey, you know what, those are actually not really a big deal. We should be focused on deaths and hospitalizations, which, again, the sort of things that conservatives have said all along, like the sheer number of cases isn't actually an effective kind of driver or pointer on any of this information. And so, but rather than actually have to wrestle with that, rather than really have to try and better understand those things and come to grips with what it means from a policy perspective for how you do everything else, it's a lot easier to just kind of ease off the brakes and go back to the life that you and everyone else enjoys and say, well, things have changed. This thing is different. And I think that's a lot more comfortable for a lot of people. And to the market effect point, yeah, I think you're right. I think it can be really easy to pretend that this kind of, ascetic approach to dealing with the pandemic is something that is good and valuable and noble. And you've got these people who they've got 8 masks on in their house with their loved ones because their kid is under 2 and can't get vaccinated or whatever it is. I think it can be, that's miserable. That is a miserable type of existence. And I think for a lot of people, the only way that you can possibly justify that miserable existence is to take all of the information you can marshal and force it through a lens of, well, I had to do this all along. Because if I had to do it, that means I am in the moral right to do it. And I didn't just do something dumb and stupid that made me unhappy for a long time.
Yeah, I really do think that's it. Hopefully we're getting past it, and maybe we'll see a little break from this in 2022. Drew Holden, freelance commentary writer. If you're not following him on Twitter, you got to be at Drew Holden 360. You're missing out on important info that Drew is putting out there all the time. Drew, thanks so much for doing the show. I appreciate it, man.
Stu, pleasure's mine. Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe to our channel so you'll be sure to see similar videos from BlazeTV with the added bonus of signaling YouTube that your voice and opinion still matters. And if you're looking for more great conservative content, check out one of the 2 videos suggested here.